Good evening, Commission. This is Kathleen Mallory, Planning and Sustainability Manager, and I'm joined this evening with Heather Davis, our Consulting Planner and Assistant Project Manager on the Housing Element Update. Tonight is part 2 of a 2-step process. We first started with presenting in great detail on September 2nd the final housing element along with a number of general plan map and text changes, and then walked the Commission through zoning map changes and a number of revisions to existing city ordinances, as well as 2 brand new ordinances. For ease, we're not going to go into the details regarding the September 2nd presentation, and also the presentation would be exceptionally long, but we did provide a link to the presentation should the public or Commission desire to re-review that very detailed presentation. And we also have that, also the verbal presentation. You can go through our YouTube site. So 2 options to take a look at that September 2nd presentation. The focus of our action this evening is the second part, the September 2nd part. I'm sorry, the September 16th part. We are going to go through a review of the questions that we received from the Commission and the public as a result of the meeting on September 2nd, in addition to the comments that we received and questions regarding the draft ordinances, which we presented to the committee and to the Planning Commission on September 2nd. So that's the real focus this evening, is to walk through modifications to the ordinances and to speak to how we responded to public input and Commission input as well. So as a reminder, we went into great detail regarding the various general plan, land use element, and housing element amendments, along with the text and ordinance amendments that would help implement the housing element. The 2030 general plan land use element, there are amendments proposed to section 3.5 and table 3.2. That's to amend the land use element, the text of the land use element to implement the programs and density in the housing element. That would be to allow 30 units per acre, as well as to allow housing on specific zones and sites. And that's all to implement what's identified in Supplement 1. Additionally, there are zoning text and map amendments. That's really the focus this evening. And we list out what we're going to be doing. There are 5 actions, and the action this evening from the Planning Commission would be to take action on each one of those 5 ordinances. The section regarding the general commercial amendments noted there, very minor in nature. The Business and Research Park Amendment, again, a very minor amendment. The bulk of the discussion this evening has to do with 2 new ordinances that we're presenting that we covered on September 2nd. That's the affordable housing permitted and affordable housing discretionary additive zone provisions. And in a moment, Heather Davis will be going over how we change those ordinances to respond to public input as well as Commission input. And then the other ordinance that you see pertaining to the density bonus provisions, very minor revision there as well. And then the second largest ordinance that we will be going over changes to pertains to the site plan review process. So really this evening, the focus is going to be on the modifications to those 2 new ordinances, and then walking through how we addressed public input. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Heather Davis.
Thank you, Kathleen. In the next few slides, I'll go over the revisions made to the draft ordinances following the September 2nd Planning Commission hearing. In addition to Planning Commission comments, staff also received written comments from a few affordable housing advocates and developers on some necessary changes to the ordinances, specifically the two new ordinances that Kathy mentioned for the affordable housing additive zone and for the new site plan review ordinance. And staff received additional input from the Oxnard Police Department and the Oxnard Fire Department. The public comments are in attachment 7 of your packet, and the ordinances are in attachment 4. Revision to the ordinances following the September 2nd hearing are marked in bold text. First, I will focus on the edits that were not made to the ordinances and why, as it's a much shorter list, but a little more detail. First, the additive zone development standards. So one of the public comments that we received requested that the 10% adjustment to the numeric development standards be increased to 25%. The state housing element law does not require the city to allow any adjustments to the development standards beyond those permitted under the density bonus legislation. This provision is an exclusive feature for projects that are 100% affordable, that was carried over from the AHOP program, the um, when advocates in the workshops for the current housing element update expressed concern over loss of this provision for 100% affordable housing projects when the AHOP program is repealed. The current AHOP ordinance allows a 10% adjustment to development standards as necessary to ensure requested densities and ensure quality development is achieved for projects which are 100% affordable. This feature helps to reduce project costs for affordable housing developers, as minor revisions can be made to development standards while reserving density bonus concessions for larger development standards. The AHOP ordinance was adopted prior to the current updates to the state density bonus legislation that are more generous for concessions for 100% affordable housing projects. Therefore, inclusion of this provision for 100% affordable projects, which can be layered with the current density bonus, allows more modifications or concessions from the municipal code municipal code than was available at the time that AHOP was adopted. However, this provision still represents a reasonable incentive to encourage affordable housing with 100% lower income units, and staff recommends that this provision be retained as written in the additive zone standards. The comment specifically requested that the provision be increased to 25% to align with the plan development permit. The plan development permit is a discretionary permit, meaning a 25% modification is not an automatic provision. The Planning Commission or City Council may choose to deny or reduce or require conditions of approval to minimize impacts of that 25%. Implementation of the council supported 10% deviation um, for ministerial development instead of the 25% plan development discretionary process cannot be argued as discriminatory and a violation of the Fair Housing Act because the 25% provision is discretionary and not automatic. Sorry for getting a little in the details there. Um, Next, the additive zone design standards. Staff received a comment that the parking setback requirement would be difficult to implement for 30 dwelling unit per acre developments. The intent of the requirement is to avoid the front of the parcel being developed with parking rather than placing the parking behind, under, or wrapped by a building. Both market rate and affordable developers within the downtown have been able to meet these standards. And as discussed a moment ago, parking requirements may also be further reduced by density bonus. Therefore, staff recommends that the text be retained. The additive zone special development requirements. Staff received a comment concerned with inclusion of these requirements. The city's housing element anticipates potential land use conflicts and with residential and non-residential uses and sets implementation standards to reduce those conflicts. The standards are intended to help ensure future multifamily are not subject to noise, odor, air emissions, contamination, or other incompatible conditions, while also allowing other non-residential uses to be allowed within the areas which currently allow non-residential use. Staff recommends that the text be retained. Um, and finally, one comment questioned the inclusion of findings within the additive zone ordinance. The findings can and should be required as they provide a way for the city to justify a decision or justify an opponent's challenge of an action on a project. Findings for ministerial projects are to be objective, resulting in a yes or no finding, whereas discretionary findings can be subjective. Um, The findings in the additive zone ordinance are largely based on the SB 35 findings for ministerial review, SB 35 from the state for affordable housing, and the California Environmental Quality Act guidelines for affordable housing exemption. Therefore, staff recommends that the text be retained. Next slide. Staff did make several changes to various sections of the ordinance in response to public comments. As there are a number, I will run through these briefly. First, we replaced project in the site plan review and additive zone ordinances to avoid misinterpretation of the ordinance as requiring seeker review as a project. We updated the additive zone mixed use development standard. This standard repeats the city's existing requirement for setbacks for mixed use in the C2 zone, so clarification was added that the standard applies to the C2 zone sites. Another change to the development standard, staff increased the maximum building height to 56 feet rather than 45 for R4 to accommodate 30 dwelling units per acre. This revision actually was not brought about by a public comment, but was noted by staff as necessary to accommodate this density outright for most types of multifamily residential development. There were several revisions to the additive zone design standards. Material change was revised to also allow color changes to reduce construction costs for affordable housing. The maximum height adjacent to the R1 district boundary was revised to match the R1 height within 20 feet of the adjacent R1 property and to increase to allow up to the maximum height for the additive zone. The site design, under site design, the term open space was replaced with common open space, and direct interaction was clarified for ground floor residential units. The refuse enclosure minimum distance from residences was increased to 150 feet to be consistent with the city's material management and enclosure design guidelines. Under the additive zone special development requirements, the complete sidewalk circulation system and bus stop provision was a requirement was added as a request by the police department. Um, the residential disclosure and health risk assessment was revised. An error was corrected that this requirement um, that had listed this requirement as only for discretionary projects. The requirements were also revised by the fire department input. And then a requirement for comprehensive tenant screening was removed. Under the site plan review application requirements, clarification was added so that it won't be misinterpreted to require unlimited material. In response to Commissioner Nash's comment, the site plan review permits will be identified on the city's development project list. And then the site plan review and density bonus appeals provision A comment requested technical revisions to the appeal language. It was reviewed and the language is approved by the city attorney. So those are also represented in the revisions to the ordinances. Kathleen, I will now turn the mic back over to you.
Great, thank you, Heather. We appreciate that. And just also to note that the ordinance, the changes, the new language is bolded and the revisions are struck through. In terms of public input we received on programs, not a ton. We did cover the programs exhaustively at the September 2nd commission meeting. We did receive an email that's in the packet for September 16th from People Self-Help, and they wanted some additional program language added. They wanted some specific language focused on schools and some specific language that was very narrow in scope and content. And we discussed it internally, and by adding language that was so very narrow, we felt like that was prohibitive. So recognizing their good input, we think we've kind of got to yes with the revision to Program 19, which would be a new bullet, and you can read it there. Continuing to promote programs through our economic development organizations and advocacies with affordable housing groups. And we also recognize that the People Self-Help would be invited to our annual housing element workshop, which we added in response to public input, which is program 43. So, and that would be an opportunity for People Self-Help to carry that information on housing programs to the school district. So we think there's a win there, and that adding that language still achieves the goals that People Self-Help expressed. And of course, then this would be an action that council would need to take on October 5th. We have in the errata document before you suggested staff changes, which are small in nature, typos, things of that scope. Any additional robust bullets or program language, we feel it's appropriate to run that by council, which would then happen on October 5th. And then we would incorporate the changes identified in the errata that is an attachment to your September 16th packet. And if council supports the addition of that bullet, we would incorporate those elements before we submit the document to HCD for certification. And then additionally, there was expressed interest from People Self-Help for pro-housing, and we covered this a lot on the September 2nd meeting. We believe that we have a number of programs that support pro-housing without formally designating that as an overlay in the city. In terms of next steps and schedule, as mentioned, council will take action on all the items you see this evening at the Planning Commission meeting. They'll take action on October 5th. And then prior to the October 15th deadline, we backed it back. We backed it back by 1 day. By October 14th, the city will submit the final housing element. And the first reading of the ordinances that Heather covered would happen on October 5th. Second reading would happen on October 19th. And we can submit the document to HCD based upon the first reading of the ordinance. So that's good news. And then the second reading of the ordinances would occur on October 19th, with the ordinances taking effect 30 days later, around November 20th. The environmental document, we prepared an initial study and mitigated negative declaration. We had standard mitigation measures as identified there, bio, paleo. Again, the action is the council's approval of the final housing element. So responses to those comment letters will accompany the October 5th council packet. We received input from those agencies you see, nothing substantial. There was a comment from Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife, which will add additional mitigations, but they're intended to be standard in nature. They just deal with disclosure. They identify protective measures that the state is recommending for wildlife, for streams and rivers. Some of the comments that Fish and Wildlife provided really did not pertain to us because where housing is recommended is in more urban areas. So those comment letters, the last item, Fish and Wildlife, that should not be considered a significant comment. And again, we will have responses to that packet, to those questions when we present the initial study in M&D for council approval on October 5th. With that, we have 6 recommendations. It's important, we thought it would be helpful, non-typical, but we thought it would be helpful to identify each attachment relative to a recommendation to help the commission follow along. The first is approval or a recommendation for approval of the final housing element. Of course, an action has to be taken to open and close the public hearing to receive input. Review the initial study in M&D, which was previously presented, and along with comment letters, and we're happy to answer any questions that commission may have on that. The 4th action would be to recommend council approval of the housing element. The 5th item would be then recommending would be recommending text amendments to the ordinance as Heather's walked the commission through. And then finally, zoning map amendments is the final action. And with that, we have concluded our presentation. I will note as well that attached to this presentation is the entirety of the September 2nd PowerPoint. If there's interest in the commission reviewing it, that is there for ease as well. Thank you.